She thought she was gaining a family. She had no idea she was uncovering a cover-up. 3 days before her wedding, a bride named Emily Carter sat alone in her future mother-in-law's study, holding a photograph that did not match the story she had been told her entire life. The house was quiet. Everyone else had gone to bed hours ago, worn out from final fittings and seating charts and the small chaos that comes before a wedding. Emily had only wanted a stapler. She never expected to find a locked box tucked behind old tax files or a photograph inside it of a man she did not recognize, standing beside a woman who looked exactly like Diane Whitmore, decades younger, in front of a house Emily had never seen. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, was a date. A date that meant nothing to Diane's story, but everything to Emily's own. Emily had always believed she understood her own history. Her father died in a car accident when she was 5 years old. That was the story her mother told her, the story her aunt repeated at every birthday when Emily asked what he had been like, the story that had quietly shaped every version of Emily she had ever become. She thought she was marrying into a new family this week. She thought the hardest part was behind her, that the only unknowns left were seating arrangements and vows. She had no idea that the woman about to become her mother-in-law was holding a secret that reached back into the exact year her father supposedly died, tying two families together in a way neither of them had ever spoken of out loud. She sat with the photograph in her hands for a long time, the kind of stillness that comes right before a person's life quietly rearranges itself. Downstairs, the house settled the way old houses do. A clock somewhere ticked past midnight. Emily told herself there had to be an explanation, some coincidence, some relative she had simply never met. But the date on the back of that photograph would not leave her alone. It matched, almost exactly, the year everyone told her that her father had died. And the woman in that photograph, younger, sharper around the eyes, was unmistakably the same woman who had picked out her wedding dress with her only weeks before, who had toasted to gaining a daughter, who had promised Emily she would never be alone in this family again. What Emily did not know that night, sitting frozen in that study with a single photograph in her hands, was how far this went. She did not know that a man everyone believed had died in a car accident 24 years ago was, at that very moment, alive and already booked to work her wedding under a different name. She did not know he would be standing quietly at the back of the venue in 3 days, close enough to watch his daughter marry a man he had never met, while the woman responsible for keeping him away from her for over 2 decades smiled for photographs a few feet away. Emily only knew one thing as she finally closed that box and sat in the dark. The family she thought she was joining was not the family she had been promised. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 days. That was all the time Emily had left before she would stand in front of everyone she loved and promise herself to a family she was only now beginning to understand. 3 days to decide what to do with a photograph that should not have existed, a date that lined up too perfectly to ignore, and a silence in that house that suddenly felt less like comfort and more like something being carefully managed. Emily kept asking herself the same questions over and over as she lay awake that night. Who was the man in that photograph, and why did Diane Whitmore look at him the way people only look at someone they have loved and lost? Why had no one, not her mother, not her aunt, not a single person in 29 years, ever mentioned a connection between her family and the woman she was about to call her mother-in-law? There was a second question that frightened her even more than the first. If Diane had kept this hidden for so long, deliberately, carefully, through years of holidays and dinners and the slow building of trust, then what else had been hidden along with it? Emily thought about every warm moment between them, the dress shopping, the toasts, the promise that she would never be alone in this family again, and wondered how much of it had been real, and how much of it had been performance from a woman protecting something far bigger than a family secret. She thought about Jason too, the man she was about to marry, and asked herself the question she was most afraid to answer. Did he know? Had he always known? Or was he about to become collateral damage in a truth his own mother had spent 2 decades burying? And there was one more question, quieter than the others, that Emily could not shake as she finally drifted off that night. If the man in that photograph was still alive somewhere, close enough that Diane still kept his picture locked away instead of thrown away, was there any chance he was closer than anyone in that house could imagine? 3 days before her wedding, Emily Carter had no answers. She only had a locked box, a mismatched date, and a growing certainty that the story of her life, the one she had believed since she was 5 years old, was not the story at all. Emily Carter had never known her father as anything other than an absence. He died when she was 5, in a car accident on a stretch of highway outside their old town, or so she had been told every year of her life since. Her mother rarely spoke of him, and when she did, it was in careful, well-worn phrases that sounded more like a script than a memory. Her aunt filled in what gaps she could, small details about his laugh, his stubbornness, the way he used to sing off-key in the kitchen, but even those stories always felt secondhand, borrowed from someone else's memory rather than lived experience. Emily grew up believing grief was simply a part of who she was, a quiet room in her life she had learned to walk past without opening. Jason Whitmore had grown up in almost the opposite world. His mother, Diane, had built a real estate empire from nothing after being widowed young, and their small Charleston social circle regarded her as something close to a local legend. She was the woman who wrote scholarship checks for kids she barely knew, who mentored young agents fresh out of college, who stood at the podium of every charity gala with the kind of composure that made people trust her instantly. Jason had grown up in the shadow of that reputation, proud of his mother, a little in awe of her, and completely unaware that the empire she had built rested on a foundation she had never once let him see. When Emily and Jason met, their worlds folded into each other easily. Diane welcomed Emily with an openness that surprised even Jason, inviting her into family dinners, insisting she call her by her first name instead of anything more formal, telling anyone who would listen that she had always wanted a daughter. Emily, who had spent so much of her life feeling like she was missing a piece of her own history, let herself believe she had finally found somewhere to belong. She trusted Diane the way a person trusts someone who has never given them a reason not to. But trust, as Emily would soon learn, is often built most carefully by people who have the most to hide. There were small moments, in hindsight, that should have given her pause. The way Diane's smile would tighten whenever old business associates were mentioned at dinner. The framed photograph in her office that she always turned face down before guests arrived. The way she changed the subject, quickly and smoothly, anytime the topic of her late husband came up in detail. At the time, Emily read these as private grief, the natural instinct of a woman who had lost someone and preferred not to relive it. She had no reason yet to read them as something else entirely. The morning after Emily found the photograph, she told herself she would let it go. She had a wedding in 3 days, a dress that still needed steaming, a florist to confirm, 100 small details demanding her attention. But the photograph would not let her go instead. She found herself standing in the doorway of Diane's study again that afternoon, waiting for the house to empty out, telling herself she only wanted one more look, one more chance to convince herself she had imagined the resemblance, the date, the strange tightness in her chest that had kept her awake half the night. The box was exactly where she had left it, still unlocked, still holding more than she had let herself see the first time. Beneath the photograph was a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges, the kind of article that gets buried once but never quite disappears. Emily unfolded it carefully. It described an embezzlement case from 24 years earlier, a company controller accused of siphoning funds before vanishing ahead of trial. His car was found wrecked at the bottom of a ravine days later. His body was never recovered. He was presumed dead, the case quietly closed, the company allowed to move forward without the scandal following it into the headlines for long. Emily read the name in that article 3 times before it fully settled into her. It was not a name she had heard often, but it was one she recognized instantly, because it belonged to her father. Not the version of him she had been given in careful, well-worn stories about a car accident. A different version entirely, one accused of theft, one who vanished under circumstances no one had ever mentioned to her, not once, in 29 years of birthdays and quiet retellings. Her hands were shaking as she set the clipping down beside the photograph, the two pieces of paper suddenly forming a story that made her stomach turn. Beneath the clipping was one more document, more recent than the others, a wire transfer dated only a few months earlier. The recipient's name meant nothing to Emily at first glance. Robert Ellery. She stared at it for a long moment, unsure why a name she had never heard before felt like it belonged somewhere close to her, before she heard footsteps on the stairs behind her and quickly closed the box, her heart pounding. The amount on that wire transfer burned into her memory before she had even finished reading it. Emily didn't sleep that night either. She lay in the dark running the name over and over in her mind, Robert Ellery, waiting for it to mean something, waiting for some buried memory to surface and explain why it felt so familiar. By morning she had made a decision. She was not going to let this go quietly into her wedding day. She picked up her phone before she had even had coffee and called her aunt, the one person who had always given her honest answers, even when they were hard ones. Her aunt did not answer the way Emily expected. There was a pause on the line, longer than a bad connection could explain, before she asked carefully what had prompted the question. Emily described the photograph, the clipping, the date that matched too closely to be coincidence. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything her aunt had said in 29 years. Finally, her aunt told her this was not a conversation for the phone and that she would explain everything after the wedding. Emily hung up more unsettled than before because, in her experience, people only postpone the truth when the truth was something they were afraid to say out loud. Determined to find her own answers, Emily spent the next day quietly digging through public records instead of waiting on family members who clearly weren't ready to talk. She found the embezzlement case again, this time with more detail, a controller accused of siphoning company funds before disappearing ahead of trial, his car found wrecked at a ravine, his body never recovered. She cross-referenced the timeline against property records for Diane's real estate company and found something that made her sit back from her laptop entirely. The company's first major acquisition, the seed investment that had launched Diane's entire empire, was dated only months after that scandal closed, funded in part by shares that had once belonged to the very man accused of stealing from his employer. There was tension building between Emily and Jason now too, though neither of them had said the real reason out loud. She had grown distant, distracted, quick to change the subject whenever he asked if something was wrong. A dinner got canceled. A conversation about final wedding details turned into a short, strained argument neither of them fully understood. Jason assumed it was wedding stress. Emily was beginning to wonder if he had always known more than he let on, and the thought alone was enough to make her stomach tighten every time he reached for her hand. Desperate for someone who might actually give her a straight answer, Emily went to see Patricia Vance, Diane's longtime attorney, a woman who had been present at nearly every major moment in the Whitmore family's history for over 20 years. Patricia did not deny anything outright. Instead, she said something that left Emily standing frozen in a law office hallway, unable to move for a full minute afterward. "That man is not who you think he is," Patricia told her. "Or rather," she said, "he is exactly who you think he is." Emily left that office with more questions than she had walked in with, but one thing had become unavoidable. Whatever Diane had been hiding for 24 years, it was not finished. It was still moving, still active, close enough that when Emily pulled up the final vendor confirmation list for her wedding 2 days later, scanning it out of habit more than suspicion, one name stopped her cold. Listed under catering consultants, quietly slotted into the schedule for the biggest day of her life, was a man named Robert Ellery. Emily confronted Diane the following morning, before either of them had time to put on the version of themselves the world usually saw. She laid the photograph, the clipping, and the wire transfer out on the kitchen table between them, and for the first time since Emily had known her, Diane Whitmore had nothing composed to say. She sat down slowly across from Emily, the color draining from her face, and after a long silence that stretched far past comfort, she finally began to speak. Diane admitted that 24 years ago, her first husband, Emily's biological father, had been accused of an embezzlement he did not commit. What she said next came out quieter than the rest, as though the words had been waiting 24 years to finally leave her. She admitted the scheme had been hers, engineered to seize control of the company and secure the capital that would eventually become the foundation of everything she built afterward. To avoid prison for a crime he never committed, he had been forced to disappear entirely, his death staged convincingly enough that no one, not investigators, not family, not even his own daughter, ever thought to question it. There was a condition attached to his survival, Diane explained, one she had enforced for over 2 decades. He was never to contact his daughter again. In exchange for his silence and his absence, Diane had quietly supported him for years, wire transfers disguised as consulting payments, enough to keep him comfortable and enough to keep him quiet, a private arrangement neither of them had ever been meant to reveal. Emily sat perfectly still as she listened, the family she thought she understood dissolving in real time in front of her. The final piece landed hardest of all. The man on Emily's catering consultant list, the man scheduled to work quietly in the background of her own wedding, was her father. He had agreed to take the job under a different name for one reason only, because he could not bring himself to miss the day his daughter got married, even if it meant standing at the back of the room as a stranger. Emily thought back to the tasting weeks earlier, a quiet, polite man who had complimented her choice of appetizers and wished her well, and realized with a wave of nausea that she had already met him without knowing it. Emily left Diane's house that afternoon and drove straight to the catering company Robert Ellery worked for, sitting in her car outside for nearly 20 minutes before she found the courage to go in. When she finally stood across from him, close enough this time to really look at his face, she saw pieces of herself she had never had a name for before, the shape of his eyes, the same stubborn set of his jaw she saw in the mirror every morning. She asked him directly why he had let 24 years pass without a single word, why he had chosen silence over a daughter who had spent her whole life believing he was gone. What Robert told her next changed the shape of everything Emily thought she understood. He had not disappeared to punish her or to protect himself, he said. Diane had made the terms of his silence very clear from the beginning. She chose the light. On her wedding day, as the doors at the back of the venue opened, it was not silence that walked her down the aisle. It was her father, Robert Ellery, in a suit instead of catering blacks, in full view of every guest, in full view of Diane Whitmore, who sat frozen in the front row as 24 years of carefully guarded silence unraveled in front of everyone she had spent her whole life trying to impress. Emily did not owe her wedding day to the woman who had cost her a father. She gave it instead to the man who had spent every one of those years quietly loving her from a distance he never chose for himself. She didn't just marry into a family that day. She reclaimed the one she had lost 24 years before, and built something new out of the truth Diane had spent 2 decades trying to keep buried. Would you have forgiven the people who took 24 years from you, or walked away for good? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one, because there are so many more stories like mine still waiting to be told.